The warning came in the form of a dead probe. Not broken, not damaged by debris. Dead, cut apart with something precise, something deliberate, and sent back to humanity's doorstep in a metal crate with a single message burned into its surface in 17 galactic languages. The translation was rough, but every linguist on Earth agreed on the meaning. You are not welcome here. Do not send another. The probe had been traveling toward the Vega system for 11 years. Humanity had packed it full of greetings, music, mathematical sequences, water samples, biological blueprints, the whole hopeful package. The kind of thing humans did when they still believed the universe was waiting for them with open arms. The crate arrived at Luna Station on a Tuesday. Director Adiz sat in the briefing room and read the translation 3 times. Around her, 12 of Earth's top minds stared at the same document. Nobody spoke for almost 2 minutes. Then Admiral Petrov cleared his throat. They cut it apart, cleanly, not weapons fire surgical. Whoever did this wanted us to know they could have done worse. They're drawing a line, said Dr. Reinhold from the linguistics team. They're telling us the boundary exists and that crossing it has consequences. Adiz set down the document. How far out is the Vega system? 25 light years, said the navigation officer at the end of the table. At our current fastest drive, roughly 42 years of travel time. Adiz nodded slowly. And the Galactic Assembly, what do they say? The answer came from the Assembly liaison, an older man named Barrows who had spent 30 years working the diplomatic channels between Earth and the 49 recognized interstellar civilizations. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. They say we should be grateful. The Vethara do not usually return anything. They usually just stop the object and leave the silence as the message. The Vethara, Adiz repeated. One of the oldest civilizations in the Assembly. They've been spacefaring for roughly 9,000 years. They control a stretch of space covering 11 star systems in that region. When they post a boundary, it stays posted. Barrows folded his hands on the table. No civilization has ever crossed a Vethara line and reported back. The room got quiet again. Outside the station's wide viewport, Earth hung blue and patient in the dark, 384,000 kilometers away. From this distance it looked small, fragile, the kind of thing something 9,000 years old might not even notice. Adiz stood up. Pull every survey record we have of that region, cross-reference with Assembly navigation charts. I want to know what's actually in that direction, not just Vega, but everything within 20 light years of their stated boundary. She looked around the room. And I want the full history of Vethara boundary enforcement, every incident on record. Barrows started to object. Director, with respect, the Assembly's position is clear. This is not a negotiating situation. The Vethara are not. I'm not negotiating, Adiz said. I'm doing my job, which is to understand exactly what we're dealing with before Earth makes any decision at all. She picked up her coat. Nobody is crossing any line today, but nobody is going to tell me what questions I'm allowed to ask. Barrows closed his mouth. The briefing broke up quietly. People filed out with the careful energy of professionals who knew they were standing at the edge of something large, the kind of something that had a way of swallowing the unprepared whole. Adiz stayed behind. She stood at the viewport for a long time, looking at the Earth below. She thought about the probe, 11 years of travel, cut apart like paper, returned with a message that was less a warning and more a demonstration. They wanted humanity to feel small. That was the real message underneath the formal language. They wanted the species on the other end to understand the gap between them and act accordingly. Bow the head, pull back, accept the boundary as fact. She thought about what humanity had done every other time something tried to make it feel small. She picked up her comm unit and opened a channel to the research division. Get me everything we have on Vethara technology, she said. Materials analysis of the probe casing, whatever tool marks or energy signatures we can extract from the cuts. I want to know how they did it, and I want a preliminary report by end of week. The researcher on the other end paused. Are we supposed to be doing that? Earth is a sovereign world, Adiz said. We are allowed to study anything that lands in our space. Start the analysis. She closed the channel. Somewhere in the assembly, 49 civilizations were watching to see how the new species would respond to its first real message from the old guard of the galaxy. Most of them expected silence, compliance, the same quiet retreat every younger species showed when the Vethara drew a line. Nobody was watching for what actually came next. The tool marks told the whole story. Dr. Yusra had been running materials analysis for 20 years. She had worked on asteroid samples, deep-sea mineral extraction, even the hull fragments from an Orathi trade vessel that had broken apart near Jupiter 6 years ago. She knew what cutting looked like: plasma torch, laser shear, molecular blade, impact fracture. She knew every signature. The cuts on the returned probe were none of those things. She ran the analysis 4 times before she wrote anything down. Then she wrote it very carefully, in plain language, because she wanted there to be no confusion. The probe had been taken apart using a method that restructured the molecular bonds of the metal itself. Not cut, not burned. The material had been persuaded, on a fundamental level, to become 2 separate things instead of one. The energy required to do that, to human technology, would have been equivalent to a small nuclear detonation per centimeter of cut surface. The probe had 47 separate cut surfaces. Some of them were less than a millimeter wide. Yusra sent the report to Director Adiz, and then sat very still at her desk for a while. Adiz read it in her office, read it again, and then called in Lieutenant Oscar from the Defense Research Division. Oscar was the kind of person who collected problems the way other people collected bad habits, always looking for the angle, the leverage point, the thing nobody else had noticed yet. He read Yusra's report standing up, nodded twice, and said nothing for 40 seconds. "They did that casually," he said finally. "What makes you say that?" Adiz asked. "Because if that level of energy manipulation was difficult for them, they would have used something simpler. You use your most precise tool when precision is easy. This was a message written with a pen, not a chisel." He set the report down. "They're 9,000 years ahead of us in this specific technology, maybe more. That's what Barrows would use to tell us to go home and stay quiet." "That's what it's supposed to make us do," Oscar said. He sat down across from her. "But here's what I noticed. The cuts are all in non-critical locations. They took the probe apart, yes, but they kept every major component intact. The drive core, the data banks, the communications array, the biological sample containers. Everything that would tell them something about us intact. Everything that was just structural, separated cleanly." Adiz looked at him. "They studied it." "They studied it thoroughly, and then they sent it back. Not destroyed, sent back, with a warning written in our languages." Oscar leaned forward. "That's not what a species does when it doesn't care about you. That's what a species does when it wants you to know exactly how much you don't measure up. There's an audience in this. They want us to understand our place relative to them. And if we don't accept that place—" Oscar smiled in the quiet way people smile when they've been thinking about something for days. "That's the interesting question." The report reached the Assembly Liaison Office the same afternoon. Barrows forwarded it up the chain as required, attaching his own recommendation. Earth should issue a formal acknowledgement of the Vethara boundary, cease all probe activity in that direction, and request a preliminary diplomatic contact through proper assembly channels. Standard protocol, safe, predictable. The Assembly's response came back in 6 hours. 41 of the 49 member civilizations agreed with Barrows. 7 abstained. 1. A small aquatic civilization called the Solaran, who had been members for only 300 years, sent a separate private message directly to Adiz's office. It said, "We understand what you are feeling. We felt it too once. We accepted the boundary. We have wondered for 300 years whether that was wisdom or surrender. We do not know the answer. We hope you find one." Adiz read that message several times. Then she called a meeting with a different kind of team, not the diplomats, not the linguists. She called the engineers, the propulsion physicists, the three researchers who had spent the last decade quietly developing a drive system that existed, officially, only as a theoretical proposal in a university archive. The team arrived without fanfare. 6 people in a small room. Adiz closed the door. "We've been studying the probe damage," she said. "I want to talk about what we learned from it, not about the Vethara's technology specifically, but about the physics it implies, what it tells us about how that region of space works and what it might mean for getting a vessel there." One of the engineers, a woman named Priya who had spent 8 years on that theoretical drive, looked up. "Getting a vessel there, the Vethara boundary is—" "I'm not talking about crossing anyone's boundary," Adiz said carefully. "I am talking about capability, about whether humanity could, in principle, reach that region of space in a timeline shorter than 42 years, whether we have, or could develop, the means to move at a speed that makes the conversation different." The room was quiet. Priya opened her notebook. "Define shorter," she said. "Years, not decades." Another silence. Then Priya said, "The theoretical framework exists. We've never built anything because there was never a reason serious enough to justify the resource commitment." She paused. "Is there one now?" Adiz thought about the Solaran message, about the word surrender, about 49 civilizations who had all, at some point, received some version of the same crate on their doorstep. "Start building," she said. 3 years later, the ship had no name yet. That was Priya's rule. You did not name a ship until it flew. Naming it before that was asking for problems, and they had enough of those already without inviting more. It sat in Dock 7 of the Lagrange construction facility, a long and angular thing that looked nothing like humanity's older vessels. No elegant curves, no smooth hull panels designed for aesthetics. This ship looked exactly like what it was, a machine built by people who had learned something from the debris of a returned probe and spent 36 months reverse engineering a principle from the physics of the damage. They had not built Vethara technology. They could not. 9,000 years of development was not something you replicated in 3 years in a dry dock. But Yusra's materials analysis had given them something else, proof of concept. The way those cuts were made told Priya's team something fundamental about the energy manipulation involved. Not the method, but the underlying principle. And from that principle, working sideways in a direction the Vethara had likely never considered because they had no reason to, Priya's team had built something different. Rougher, less elegant, like comparing a hand axe to a surgical blade. Both of them cut. The drive was called a fold pressure system informally. It did not travel faster than light in any classical sense. What it did was find a point ahead of the vessel and a point behind it, and apply extreme localized pressure to the space between them, compressing it, not violently but persistently like a long, slow exhale, until the gap was shorter than it had been before. The ship did not move faster. The distance moved shorter. It was inefficient. It was energy hungry. It chewed through fuel reserves at a rate that required the ship to carry almost nothing else. But for short-duration pushes into a specific target region, the numbers worked. Luna to Vega, 11 weeks. The test run happened on a Thursday with almost no ceremony. 6 crew, minimal life support redundancy, enough food and water for 16 weeks. The mission was simple and very clearly defined. Travel to the edge of the Vethara boundary zone, stop outside it, take readings, return. Do not cross. Do not broadcast. Do not make contact. Just look. Director Adiz was not on the ship. Her job was to be on Earth when the information came back, and to deal with the conversation that would follow. She watched the launch from Luna Station's viewport with Admiral Petrov standing 2 meters to her left and Barrows standing 2 meters to her right, neither of them speaking. The ship folded out of local space in a shimmer that looked less like departure, and more like the universe, politely forgetting the vessel had ever been there. Barrows said very quietly, "If the Vethara detect them." "They might," Adiz said. That's part of what we're learning. This is not what the assembly recommended. No, she agreed, it isn't. Petrov, who had said nothing at all, finally looked over at Barrows. The assembly has 49 civilizations that accepted the Vethara's terms without knowing what was on the other side of that line. We are going to be the civilization that looks first and decides second. He went back to watching the empty space where the ship had been. That's what we do. 11 weeks later, 11 weeks during which Earth publicly said nothing, during which the Assembly flagged 3 diplomatic inquiries about unusual energy readings in the outer system that Earth politely categorized as ongoing propulsion research, during which Barrows went through 4 sleepless nights and filed 2 formal objections that Adiz read, acknowledged, and filed. The ship came back. Its name, painted on the hull in letters that Priya had added herself during the return trip, was persistent. The crew looked tired but not dead, which was the baseline requirement. The pilot, a quiet man named Dario who had been flying experimental craft for 12 years and had the calm demeanor of someone who had made peace with large risks, delivered his report sitting down with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. We parked at the boundary edge for 9 days, Dario said. Passive sensors only, no active emissions, no communications, just watching. And Adiz said, 3 things. He pulled up the data on the table display. First, the boundary zone is not empty. There are structures, large ones, not military installations, or at least not primarily military. They look like observation posts, listening stations. The Vethara have sensors covering every approach to their space, dense coverage, but most of it is oriented inward. They're watching their own space more than they're watching for intruders. What does that tell us? That whatever they're worried about is already inside their boundary, not outside it. Dario took a slow breath. Second thing, we detected 3 other vessels during our observation window, not Vethara ships, different registry configurations. They were operating inside the boundary zone on what looked like scheduled patrol routes, but they were not Vethara design. Smaller, faster, some kind of auxiliary force. The room was very quiet. Third thing, Dario said. On day 7, one of those vessels stopped, oriented toward us, held position for about 6 hours, then resumed its route. They knew you were there, Adiz said. Yes, he said, and they didn't do anything about it. Adiz looked at the data on the table, looked at the structures in the imagery, vast and orderly, and built by something that had been watching the galaxy longer than humanity had been walking upright. They let you observe, she said slowly. They knew you were there and they let you watch. Dario nodded. That's my read. Adiz thought about that for a long time, about a species 9,000 years into space, about observation posts pointed inward, about auxiliary ships running patrol routes in a zone that was supposedly impenetrable, about a vessel that noticed a human ship sitting quietly at the border and chose to do nothing. They're not afraid of being studied, Oscar said from the corner of the room. They're afraid of something else. Nobody disagreed with him. The contact came from their side first. That surprised everyone, including Adiz, who had spent a significant amount of time preparing for the scenario where humanity reached out. She had not prepared as carefully for the version where something else knocked on the door. The signal arrived at Luna Station at 3:40 on a Wednesday, on a frequency that did not match any human or assembly communication standard. It took 4 hours to decode, not because it was complex, but because it was old. The encoding scheme was a version of mathematical sequencing that the assembly's oldest civilizations had used roughly 2,000 years ago, before standardization. Someone had dusted it off deliberately. Someone who wanted to communicate without going through assembly channels. The message was addressed, specifically to Director Adiz by name. It said, "You parked at our boundary and did not cross. You observed and did not broadcast. We are aware of your drive technology. We are aware it took you 3 years to develop it from the evidence we left you. We wish to speak. Come to the boundary edge. 1 vessel. No weapons. We will meet you there. This offer expires in 30 days. Adiz read the message in her office at 7:40 with Oscar and Barrows on either side of her. Barrows looked like a man standing next to a large fire and wondering whether he should try to put it out or just start running. Oscar looked like a man who had been expecting something exactly like this, maybe not in this form, but in this spirit. They watched us watching them, Adiz said. Yes, said Oscar. And they want to talk. They want to talk outside assembly channels, Barrows said. He rubbed his face. That alone is extraordinary. The Vethara do not have bilateral conversations with developing civilizations. All their relations go through the assembly framework, which means the assembly controls the context. Meeting us outside that framework means. It means they want to say something they don't want the other 49 civilizations to hear, Adiz said. The silence that followed had weight to it. Preparing Persistent for a second run took 8 days. Priya's team replaced the fold pressure coils, which had degraded somewhat on the first trip, and recalibrated the passive sensor array. The crew was for this time Dario again, Yusra for technical analysis, a diplomat named Finn who spoke 7 languages and had a calm that bordered on unsettling, and Adiz herself. Barrows objected strenuously to Adiz going personally. She listened to his full argument, thanked him for it, and went anyway. The fold to the boundary edge took 10 weeks and 4 days. During that time, the crew did what people do in small spaces over long periods. They worked, ate, slept, argued mildly about music choices, and did not talk much about what was waiting for them at the other end. On the 8th day out from the boundary, a vessel appeared on sensors. It was large, not military large. It had no weapon signatures, no obvious shielding, none of the energy profiles associated with a combat vessel. It was large the way a cathedral is large, the kind of scale that speaks less about power and more about the patience of the thing that built it. It was roughly spherical, surface covered in sensor arrays and communication dishes, moving at a fraction of its probable maximum speed. It stopped 300 kilometers from Persistent and waited. Fenn opened the standard hailing frequency. This is the Earth vessel Persistent. We are here in response to your invitation. We come in good faith and with no weapons. The response came in 11 seconds, faster than the distance should have allowed, which said something about their communication technology that Yusra immediately started nodding down. The voice that answered was synthesized, clearly translated in real time, and used a tone that was impossible to read as either warm or cold. It was simply present. We are the Vethara diplomatic function. We received your vessel. We acknowledge your approach. What you are about to hear has not been shared with the Galactic Assembly. We require your word as a civilization that it will not be. Adiz leaned toward the communication array. You have our word. A pause, then, we are dying. The words sat in the cabin of Persistent like stones, dropped into still water. Not quickly, not visibly, but the rate of our technological advancement has plateaued for approximately 800 years. Our population growth has ceased. Our expansion has stopped not by choice, but because we have reached the edge of what our current framework can sustain. We have had no original scientific discovery in 4 centuries. The voice paused again. We sent back your probe because we did not want another young species entering this region and absorbing the same stagnation we have created here. The boundary was not dominance. It was quarantine. Yusra grabbed her notebook. Finn's expression, for the first time, showed something that was not calm. Adiz was quiet for a moment. You're telling us you built a wall to protect us from what's inside it. Partly, the voice said, and partly to protect ourselves from what you represent. Which is? Change, it said. You rebuilt your drive technology from debris analysis in 3 years. Our best projections suggested a species at your development level would require 40 to 60 years to derive that principle independently, if they derived it at all. You did it in 3. A pause that felt, for the first time, like something more than processing delay. That is not the behavior of a species that should be kept outside a boundary. That is the behavior of a species that changes the conditions of a problem by refusing to accept them. Adiz sat back in her chair. Outside the viewport, the Vethara vessel floated enormous and ancient and patient in the dark. 9,000 years of history in a hull. A civilization that had built the wall not to keep others out, but to stop feeling the ache of its own ceiling. "What are you asking us for?" she said. The answer took longer this time, almost a full minute. "We do not know," the voice finally said. "We have not asked anything of anyone in 4,000 years. We are learning how to do it again." Dario, who had been silent at the pilot console throughout the entire conversation, let out a breath slowly. Yusra pressed her pen against her notebook without writing anything. Fen looked at Adiz. Adiz looked at the ship outside. "Then we have something in common," she said. "We're still learning too." The talks lasted 19 days. They happened in the space between the two vessels, no docking, no exchange of crew, no physical contact of any kind. The Vethara were cautious about that in a way that took Fen a full day to understand, and then explain to the others in a quiet voice, choosing his words carefully. "They're not afraid of us biologically," he said. "They're afraid of what prolonged proximity does culturally. They've absorbed smaller civilizations before, early in their history, not violently, just by existing near them. Their scale, their age, their accumulated weight. Younger species bent toward them without meaning to. Took on Vethara values, Vethara frameworks, stopped developing their own. They didn't want that to happen with us." "They're worried about contaminating us," Yusra said. "They're worried about flattening us," Fen corrected. "There's a difference." The Vethara spokesperson, they did not give a name, which Fen said was consistent with a civilization old enough to have moved past individual identity as a diplomatic currency, spoke for approximately 6 hours each day. The rest of the time was theirs. The persistent crew would regroup, eat, argue, and then Fen and Adiz would return to the communication array with their questions shaped and ready. What emerged over 19 days was a picture that none of them had been prepared for. Not frightening, exactly, but heavy in the way that the truth is always heavy when it is larger than you expected. The Vethara had, in their long history, encountered 8 civilizations that had reached their level of development and plateaued in the same way. All 8 had eventually declined. 2 had survived in a reduced form, still functional but no longer growing. 6 were gone, not destroyed, simply ended, the way a fire goes out when there is nothing left to burn. The Vethara believed themselves to be on the same path. They had identified the stagnation roughly 800 years ago. They had tried, within their framework, every solution they could generate, restructuring their research incentive systems, opening internal knowledge exchanges, reducing boundary enforcement for lower-tier civilizations. All of it had produced minor fluctuations in their development curve and nothing more. Because, as the spokesperson explained on day 11 in terms that Yusra spent the next 2 nights transcribing in full, we cannot see outside our own framework. Every solution we generate is built from the vocabulary of our existing knowledge. We have no new vocabulary. We have not had new vocabulary in 400 years. We recognized this problem and could not solve it because the recognition itself was conducted in the same language as the problem. Yusra looked up from her notes. "They need someone to ask the wrong questions," she said. Everyone looked at her. "They've got a system, old, stable, enormous, all optimized for efficiency. When you optimize hard enough for long enough, you stop being able to see the inefficiencies that might be productive. The dead ends that turn out not to be dead ends." She tapped her pen on the table. "They need someone from outside the system to walk through it and say, what happens if you do it wrong on purpose? Because they've lost the ability to do that themselves." "That's us," Dario said. "That's us," Yusra agreed. The proposal that took shape over the remaining 8 days was modest by the scale of what the Vethara were capable of offering. They were not offering technology transfer. They were not opening their space to human colonization. What they were offering was access to their archives, to their inactive research programs, to the 400 years of failed experiments that their own scientists had concluded were worthless. Failed experiments are not worthless, Adiz said on day 17. They're just questions that haven't found the right person to answer them yet. That is a perspective we have not been able to maintain internally, the spokesperson said. Our researchers who fail are reassigned. Their work is archived and not revisited. It has been this way for 300 years. Because failure is expensive when you're running an empire, Oscar had said in the pre-mission briefings. He wasn't here, but Adiz had been thinking about his comment on and off for days. When you're small and fast, failure is cheap. You just try again. When you're big and slow, failure costs more than the civilization wants to pay. We don't have that problem yet, Adiz said to the spokesperson. We've failed constantly and recently. We have people who specialize in it. A pause. You find that to be an advantage. We find it to be unavoidable, she said, so we made it useful. The formal terms were simple. Earth would send teams, researchers, engineers, people with no stake in existing Vethara frameworks, to review their archived failed research. No obligation to produce results on any timeline. No expectation of deference to Vethara methodology. Complete freedom to ask wrong questions, propose embarrassing ideas, and try things the Vethara had already dismissed. In exchange, the Vethara would provide Earth with navigational data for the regions beyond their territory, information about what lay further out that the Assembly's charts either didn't cover or deliberately obscured. They would also quietly withdraw the boundary for Earth-registered vessels, without public announcement. The other civilizations in the Assembly, Adiz said, they'll notice the boundary change. Some will, the spokesperson agreed, the ones that have been watching closely. And the ones that were given the same crate we were. A long pause, the longest of the entire 19 days. Some of them, the spokesperson said slowly, may benefit from knowing that the crate had a different answer than they provided. Adiz thought about the Solaran message, the word surrender, 300 years of wondering. Would you be open, she said carefully, to allowing us to share the broad outline of this conversation with a small number of other civilizations, not the full terms, not the research access, just the fact that the boundary was a warning, not a wall, that there was a reason behind it and that the reason can be talked about. Another long pause. We will consider it, the spokesperson said. It was not a yes, but it was the first time in the entire 19 days that it had not been a no. On day 19, the talks ended with no ceremony and no formal signing. The Vethara did not do ceremony for things they considered preliminary. And this, the spokesperson made clear, was preliminary. The relationship between their civilization and humanity was, in their reckoning, in its very first moments. You are a young species, the spokesperson said. You have not yet made the large mistakes. We've made plenty of mistakes, Dario said from the pilot's seat, not through the diplomatic channel, just into the cabin air. Adiz smiled at that. Perhaps, the spokesperson said, apparently having heard it, but not the ones that cost civilizations their futures. You still have the capacity to be wrong in new ways. That is rarer than you know. The Assembly found out 8 months later. Not through any leak, not through any careless disclosure. They found out because the Vethara told them. A formal communication distributed simultaneously to all 49 member civilizations, brief and characteristically opaque. The boundary restriction on the Sol System vessel registry had been lifted, and a preliminary exchange framework had been established with the human species. No explanation, no context, just fact. The Assembly spent 3 weeks in a state that could charitably be described as confused and uncharitably described as panicked. The Vethara had never entered a bilateral arrangement outside Assembly mediation. The Vethara had never lifted a boundary restriction on any species in recorded history. The Vethara had certainly never done both simultaneously, quietly, and without inviting Assembly observation. Barrows, back on Earth, fielded 17 formal inquiries in the first 4 days alone. He handled them with the careful precision of a man who had been surprised by the universe, was still surprised, and was choosing to deploy that surprise selectively. Earth entered preliminary research exchange discussions with the Vethara under mutual terms, he told each inquiring delegation. The details remain between the two parties for the time being. Earth's diplomatic posture remains one of respect for assembly structures and cooperative membership. What he did not say, that the research teams were already being assembled, that Priya had been the first to volunteer and had spent 6 weeks reading Vethara theoretical physics until her colleagues were gently concerned about her, that 3 other engineers had requested to join her and had been quietly cleared, that Yusra had compiled the first pass on the Vethara's archived failed experiments and come back with 47 distinct avenues that she considered, in her professional opinion, not failed at all but simply unfinished. What he also did not say, that Adiz had in fact sent a brief message to the Solaran. Not the full terms, not the research access, exactly what she had asked the Vethara for permission to share, the fact that behind the crate, behind the boundary, behind the 9,000-year silence, there had been something other than contempt, that the wall had been built for reasons that, when understood, made different answers possible. The Solaran had replied in 4 hours. The message was 3 lines long. We have been members of this assembly for 300 years. In that time, we have received one honest answer from the Vethara, given through a human intermediary, about a question we were told never to ask. We do not have words large enough for what that is worth. Please tell us how we can help. Adiz kept that message in a file she returned to often. The first human research team arrived at the Vethara observation post 6 weeks after the assembly announcement. 4 researchers, including Priya, given access to a single archive room containing 40 years of decommissioned Vethara propulsion research. They were given 2 Vethara liaison officers, the equivalent of archivists, who would answer questions but offer no guidance. The liaison officers on day 3 filed an internal report that Adiz was given access to under the terms of the exchange. She read it twice. It said, "The human researchers have asked in 3 days more questions about Archive Section 7 than our own researchers asked in 30 years of active study. Several questions have no good answers in current Vethara theory. 2 questions appear to be entirely new. Recommend expanded archive access." Priya, when she found out Adiz had read the report, sent her a message that said, "I told you the dead ends weren't dead ends. I want access to Section 12. She got it. Back on Earth, in the 6 months following the assembly announcement, the story of what had actually happened, not the diplomatic version, but the actual version, the one with the dead probe and the small ship named Persistent, and the 19 days of talks at the edge of a boundary, that story filtered out slowly. It went through technical journals first, then popular science coverage, then the kind of broad cultural awareness that happens when people realize the thing they are hearing is not just news, but is also a story about something they recognize. The something they recognized was this: a species was told to stand back, and instead of standing back, it studied the message, built the means to answer it, showed up quietly at the line without crossing it, and listened when the thing on the other side, after 9,000 years of silence, decided it had something worth saying. Not aggression, not submission, something harder than both. The Galactic Assembly, in its formal session that year, tabled 3 motions related to the Vethara-Earth arrangement. 2 were procedural objections from older civilizations that found the bilateral structure irregular. The third, submitted jointly by a coalition of 11 younger member species including the Solaran, requested a formal review of the Assembly's standard first contact protocols. Specifically, the sections that governed how boundary warnings from advanced civilizations should be interpreted and responded to. The motion passed by a margin of 29 to 20. Barrows, reading the result in his office, rubbed his face the way he did when he was trying to decide whether to be relieved or alarmed. Then he sent Adiz a message. "The Assembly just voted to review the very protocols the Vethara used to tell us to go home," he wrote. I am not sure whether to congratulate you or file another formal objection. Adiz read it and wrote back, file the objection, then buy yourself a decent dinner. You've earned it. She set her calm down and looked out the viewport at Earth below. Still blue, still patient. A little less small, maybe, than it had looked 2 years ago, standing in this same spot watching a ship disappear into the dark. Somewhere out past the old boundary, in a vault of archived dead ends, Priya was asking wrong questions. The universe was learning to find that interesting.